This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. This podcast series, How Did We Get Here, aims to provide background and context to big stories in the news. Well, this one certainly does that, and on some scale. Where did concepts like human rights, the division between religion and the state, even sexual morality come from? According to the historian and author Tom Holland, all this and more comes from Christianity. Quite simply, we wouldn't recognise what we call Western civilisation without the religion that sprang from a particular man at a particular moment in a particular place 2,000 years ago. I spoke to Tom Holland about his book, Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind.
Essentially, everything that makes the West Western, so culturally, civilizationally distinctive, essentially derives from Christianity, and that we're so oblivious to this by and large because we essentially are goldfish and the waters in which we swim are Christian. So unless we go to some effort to work out what these waters are that we're swimming in, we risk just taking them for granted and assuming that what I think are actually very culturally contingent attitudes are just human nature.
Okay, but there are also an awful lot of influences before the Christians came along, before Jesus Christ. There are enormous influences on the Western mind, for want of a better phrase. What about, the Greek philosophers or the Jewish tradition? Are you saying that those have simply been superseded? They're not important? Don't they have a role as well beyond Christianity?
Well, nothing comes from nothing. And that's why the book actually opens not with the birth of Jesus, but with the crucifixion of a Persian general on the shores of Hellespont in 489 BC. And the reason for that is that I think that Christianity is like a kind of lake into which many different rivers flow. And I begin with a Persian general being crucified because a crucial influence on the way that what becomes Christianity develops is the Persian notion that the universe is moral, has a moral purpose. And more specifically, that there are kind of profound shades of darkness and light, of falsehood and truth. That Persian influence comes into Christianity by the medium of Jewish scripture. The the Judeans are taken to Babylon. Babylon is then captured by the Persians. The Jewish exiles clearly come under the influence of this Persian notion of dualism. Obviously, the inheritance of Jewish scripture is the greatest influence on what becomes Christianity. Then, in addition to that, as you said, there's the inheritance of Greek philosophy. I think particularly the Stoics, and the Stoics preach an idea that clearly foreshadows Christian ideals of universalism. That Stoics have an idea that the divine is manifest in everything, and therefore in every human being, and therefore every human being has a spark of the divine, what the Stoics call synodesis, a word that Paul will then take up and use to describe what we now, I guess, would call conscience. Okay. And then over on top of that, there's Roman universalism. There's the fact that Jesus and the first Christians are born into a Mediterranean that has become, for the first time ever, under the control of a single power. So all these various elements are kind of like the ingredients of a cocktail. But, if you drink gin, if you drink tonic separately, it's clearly not the same as a gin and tonic. And Christianity is the kind of cultural gin and tonic that emerges from this great confluence of elements, to mix my metaphors very badly.
Maybe that should have been the subtitle, Christianity, the cultural gin and tonic. And your book, indeed, as you say, begins before Jesus and proceeds chronologically and has all those elements, those influences there feeding in. I was intrigued by what you had to say about the kind of central message of Christianity and the crucifixion as being such a central part of that, which was, and my interpretation of what you're saying was that almost one of the most powerful messages of the early Christians was around the portrayal of a figure of weakness, a figure who was in such, had been brought to such a terrible situation, and yet this was transformed into a message of strength. And my impression was this was something that hadn't really been done before by a great religion.
Yes. I think there's a reason why the cross stands at the heart of Christianity. I think it's become the most globally recognized symbol probably that humanity has ever devised. And the cross is emblematic of the revolution that Christianity brings, because to the Romans, the cross served as a billboard of Roman power. If you think of Spartacus, all the slaves being crucified along the Appian Way, those slaves are there to serve as advertisements for the right of Rome to torture to death anyone who resists them, and more specifically to torture to death any slave who resists his master. So crucifixion is paradigmatically the fate that is visited on slaves, because it's not just an excruciating death, it's a publicly humiliating death. And in the Roman world, public dignity is the measure of a man. So that someone suffered this fate could be hailed as a god, and in fact not just any god, but the one God who has created all the universe, the one God of Israel, is bizarre in every way. It's bizarre to the Jews for obvious reasons, but it's bizarre to the Greeks and the Romans as well, because the idea that a human can become a god is not, of course, in any way strange. The world is ruled, when Jesus is born, by a man who will become a god, Caesar Augustus. And Caesar Augustus himself, rather like Jesus, is the son of a god, Julius Caesar, who likewise has been elevated into the ranks of the heavens. But the idea that a crucified criminal, someone who has suffered the death of a slave, could be elevated as a god, it's not just shocking, but in light of the growing cult of the Caesars, it verges on the blasphemous, because what Christians are doing is saying, actually, the Son of God is not Augustus. It's this guy who was tortured to death in an obscure province for insurgency against Rome. And that is very, very bizarre.
So how does that message cut through in that environment? Or did Christians just get lucky in that an emperor converted to Christianity?
Well, I think it's going with the grain of all those elements that I was talking about before. So it's making play with all kinds of ideas that are very much part of the flux of the various cultures that exist in the Mediterranean at the time. But I think that at its heart, it's the potency of the story of the Passion and the Resurrection, because it humanizes, for instance, philosophy in all kinds of ways. The Stoic idea that the divine exists in everyone, that is expressed through abstract terms by people who are there to serve the elite. What the story of the death and resurrection of Christ does is to dramatize it in the most potent way. I mean, it's the most remarkable story. It's probably the most successful story that's ever been told. So there's something about that narrative that cuts through. And on top of that, it offers to people, to slaves, to women, to the disadvantaged, to the sick, the reassurance that the one creator God, who is more powerful than any human being, more powerful than Caesar, more powerful than their masters, more powerful than the superiors, that he loved them so much that he was willing to suffer this death. And so it gives them a dignity, a sense of individual worth that you can see would obviously be enormous appealing in a world that had been taken for granted, that vast swathes of humanity are just inferior by nature. Christianity says, no, you're not inferior by nature.
Let's talk about some of the concepts that you talk about in the book, which you say basically exist only because of Christianity, which we've sort of come to just assume is part of the air we breathe and the world we inhabit. I mean, even something like, I don't know, love, for instance. would you say that love essentially exists in our way of thinking about it because of Christianity and wouldn't be there otherwise?
No, I think the idea of love is obviously something that everyone has felt. There are, and the understanding of it varies from culture to culture, civilization to civilization. But I do think that Christianity places an unusual emphasis on the idea of love. And the idea of, again, to go back to the crucifixion, the idea that the one creator God so loved every human being who's been fashioned that he is willing to suffer this terrible death privileges the idea of love to repeat myself, I think the most mythically potent form that has ever been expressed in that way. And that's why the power of love, the idea that we should love everyone, is so fundamental to the way that by and large people in the West today predicate their assumptions about human nature, about human relations.
Let's take another one, secularism then. Even the very idea of the separation of the kind of earthly political power and religious belief. Again, you seem to say that you feel that's come very much out of a Christian tradition.
That is absolutely exclusively Christian and indeed exclusive to Latin Christendom. And it's evident within the very word secular and indeed the very word religion, the idea that these are two distinct categories, that they're separate. Absolutely. I think by and large people in the West and indeed, in places that have been influenced by the West, so Turkey, India, even Japan, all define themselves as secular. These all bear the stamp of a very distinctive evolution of Christian theology from the seedbed of Christian history. And essentially, you can trace it right the way back to the Gospels, to Jesus being asked, should people pay taxes to Caesar, and asking for a coin and saying, whose head is on this coin? And the answer comes, Caesar's. And so Jesus famously says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's, kind of setting up a sense of there being a division. But this then becomes enshrined really in the wake of the sack of Rome in 410, when there are many non-Christian Romans who say, this has happened because we have betrayed the religio, the bond that should exist between Rome and the gods. There are many, many religiones. A religio could be a priesthood, can be a sacrifice, can be a feast day. It's the things that join human beings to the gods. And it's a kind of insurance policy. You offer a sacrifice to a god, the god then will look after you.
So I just jump in there. So obviously, I imagine there will be people who will say, can't you have a Muslim tradition of a separation of sort of earthly power and religious belief? Can you not have a Hindu tradition of a separation? Are you really saying this is
no? You don't.
Out of Christianity.
You don't get that. In Islam, God's prescriptions govern everything. There is no, the idea of there being a law, a sunnah, that penetrates every aspect of human existence. To divide the notion of there being divine law or secular law is completely alien to Islam. This is very, very distinctive to the way that Christianity emerges in the West, because because to go back to the anxiety that Romans felt at the sack of Rome. The Christian answer is articulated by Augustine, the great theologian bishop from North Africa, who says, actually, there is only one religio, and that religio joins us to the eternity of heavens. And that is what will enable us to escape what he defines as the cyculum, which essentially is the limit of human memory. So it's the flux of things, the way that people are born, live, die. And Augustine says, well, this is true of empires as well, even Rome. If Rome falls, it doesn't matter. It's just an earthly kingdom. And over the course of Christian history, this sense of there being a division between the dimension of the cyculum, the dimension of earthly flux, and the religio that joins people to the eternity of heaven becomes institutionalized. It inspires great convulsions of revolution. And by the time in the 18th and 19th centuries that Europeans are colonizing other areas of the world that are not Christian, they take with them this conceptualization. So they take it to the world of Islam. They impose it on Muslims. They take it to India. They look around and they say, they call it Hindustan. The Indians they call Hindu. So they say, what is the religion of the Hindus? And they construct something called Hinduism that is modelled on their idea that Christianity exists as something from the secular. But it means nothing to Indians in the 18th century. These are wholly alien concepts. But because the British are speaking English, because Hinduism, religion, secular are concepts that Indians, if they're learning English, basically just kind of absorb without even realizing it, by the time the British leave India, they leave behind, possibly as their most enduring legacy, the idea that there exists something called the secular, which is why India to this day is a secular republic. Although I think that you see with Narendra Modi and the idea of Hindu, that there's a real kickback against that. I think there's a kind of often inchoate recognition that actually the idea of the secular is an alien importation.
Okay, right. Now for what we might describe as the X-rated part of the discussion, which is the sort of inference of Christianity on sexual behaviour and sexual, mores and what is acceptable. Again, you seem to say that the very idea of sort of sexual deviancy comes out of the Christian beliefs that grew up, and St. Paul being central to that. Is that fair?
Well, no, I think every society, every culture has ideals of sexual deviancy. It's just that our ideas, the way that we conceptualize it, are profoundly different, say, to those of the Romans. For us, the way that we categorize sexuality as a binary it revolves around gender. Are you male? Are you female? For the Romans, that was a kind of really a detail. For the Romans, it revolved around power, as so much did in the Roman world. Do you have power? Do you not have power? In the Roman world, the guy who has power is the free male Roman citizen. And essentially, if you lack power, so if you are not a part of a free Roman citizen's family, immediate blood relations, but if you are part of his household, you are entirely subject to whatever he wants to do with you. It doesn't matter whether you are adult, child, male, female, you are there essentially, you can be raped. It's absolutely his right. And so these are the households that Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, which is a Roman colony, when he writes to the Romans, obviously, these are the people that he's trying to change their assumptions about what sexual morality should be. And so you can imagine the shock of a Roman householder being told, actually, you're not allowed to rape your dependents because you must be like Christ and you must regard women as being like the church. And the relationship between Christ and church provides the only acceptable template for a sexual relationship between two human beings, which obviously massively shifts the gears because it's recalibrating the idea that sexual dynamics should revolve around power. But it's also saying that the fundamental dynamic that must exist is between men and women, and more specifically, it enshrines the idea of a monogamous lifelong relationship as being the fundamental. And these are ideas that are so contrary to how the Romans see things that on one level it seems remarkable that Christianity spreads as successfully as it does. But on the other hand, you can absolutely see the appeal of this to people who are not free Roman citizens. And, so if you're a slave girl in a Christian's household, suddenly your body is something that is sacrosanct, that is intact, that has been fashioned in God's image, and therefore must be treated with the utmost respect, even by the most powerful man. So you can see why this is an ideal that actually ends up spreading very fast, to the degree that by the 6th century, assumptions that would have seemed utterly bizarre to people in the lifetime of Julius Caesar are being taken for granted by people across what remains of the Roman Empire.
And you bring in the book this all up to date with Harvey Weinstein and Me Too, and trace the way that sort of power relationship that certain powerful individuals can still have is then viewed through the prism of the way sexuality was regarded, going all the way back to the sort of thing you've just been talking about.
Yeah, well, I think that the assumption that a man should show sexual continence and should respect the bodily integrity of a woman has essentially been the ideal in Christian civilization right from the beginning. And it's taken many forms. It's distinctive form in the Middle Ages, distinctive form with Puritans and so on. But basically that remained taken for granted essentially up until the 60s, when the idea that this was actually repressive, it was uptight, the idea that the Romans are all having great sex and then Paul turns up wagging his finger and ruining the party and it's a massive downer. This kind of really kicks in. And the idea that actually people have the right to express themselves sexually any way they want becomes part of the kind of the great bonfire of traditional values that the 60s is all about. And that's something that has continued to blaze its way through Western culture ever since the 60s. But I think that what the Harvey Weinstein affair shows is that actually, by and large, people remain deeply uncomfortable about following this through to its implications. Because essentially, if men in particular have a license to do whatever they want to do, then almost inevitably it's going to lead them to do what Roman householders did, namely to take for granted that they have the right to sexually molest their inferiors, those who are dependent on them. And the fact that Harvey Weinstein is now in prison shows that society is not yet ready to accept that. And the whole Me Too movement was dependent for its impact not just on women accepting it, but men accepting it. And by and large, most men did accept it and do accept it. And so the wonderful kind of illustration of the various paradoxes that are thrown up by this is the way in which, during all the women's marches that followed the Weinstein affair, the launching of Me Too, Trump's election, one of the most popular costumes that marchers would wear were the red robes and white bonnets of handmaids from the TV adaptation of Margaret Atwood's novel, which is, of course, essentially a parody of Puritan New England. But what these women are demanding is that men behave like Puritans. And that essentially, I think, is where we are. We're in a kind of cultural, moral, ethical Moebius strip, where the very criticisms of Christianity derive from Christianity.
I mean, that's almost like the central part of your book, is that even things that don't appear to be Christian are in some ways maybe a response to Christianity, or are just so imbued with the Christian experience that we've almost forgotten that that's where it comes from.
Well, I think that there is a kind of trend within the Western form of Christianity that almost makes atheism inevitable, because the conceit of the Enlightenment is that it's a great change. Light has been brought into a world that was governed by darkness. Superstition has been banished. Idols have been overthrown. And yet, when you ask yourself, well, where are these concepts coming from? Where are these categories coming from? Where are the assumption that these are necessarily positives coming from? They're not coming from ancient Greece. They're not coming from China or India. They are clearly coming most immediately from the Protestant Reformation, which conceptualizes the medieval church in exactly those terms. Darkness must be banished, idols must be overthrown, superstition must be banished. But again, these are exactly the terms that Christian missionaries in early medieval Europe, for instance, going into forests and chopping down trees that are sacred to Thor. It's exactly the terms that they're using as well. And the reason that they're using those terms is because the idea is there in the language of the Hebrew prophets. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, the toppling of idols, the banishing of superstition. So the fact that Richard Dawkins is so animated by a need to banish superstition and to topple idols simply illustrates how clearly he stands in a line of descent that ultimately goes back to Isaiah and Jeremiah.
Okay, your book is shot through with fantastic concept ideas, lots to think about. But I also want to stress that it is full of incredible stories and extraordinary individuals. I mean, almost every other page you come across yet another man or woman who has done something extraordinary in the whole sort of Christian story. Who's your favourite, if I can put it like that? When you were, maybe you came across one in your research, or a long-term favourite.
Well, when I want each there are 21 chapters, and each chapter begins with a particular vignette, a story, an episode, some of which involve figures that everyone will have heard of, so Luther or whatever. But by and large, I wanted to try and pick on people that maybe lots of people wouldn't have heard of, and I wanted to do that for two reasons. Firstly, I wanted to tell stories because I think that stories are fundamental to the success of Christianity. I talked about the story of the Passion and the Resurrection, but of course there are also the parables that Christ himself tells. There's the whole, the Bible is a sequence of remarkable stories. It's narrative really that has served to put down the roots of Christianity as deeply as they have been put down. But also, I wanted to fix on people who may be obscure, because that again is one of the great themes of Christianity, that actually it's the obscure person as much as the great person who is loved by God. That's one of the key teachings. So there are all kinds of people who appear in the book that people might not expect to find in a book on Christianity. So the Beatles appear. There's a paleontologist in the wilds of 19th century Montana. But I think the story that I found most remarkable, and which I kind of fell on with whoops of joy, was a throwaway comment in a book about medieval heresy, where it talked about a female cousin of the Duke of Milan, who was executed as a heretic for proclaiming that the Pope was going to become female, that all the cardinals were going to become female, and that the Holy Spirit had come down to earth in the form of a female, which obviously didn't go down tremendously well with the Inquisition, which is why she ended up being burned. But it's the most extraordinary. It's the beginning of the 14th century, and it's like something out of Umberto Eco. I'm sure Umberto Eco probably has written about it somewhere, but I mean, it's like something out of The Name of the Rose, and such an odd story, so full of kind of
what was her name again?
But in a completely expected way, because when you realise what they're doing, you understand exactly why, of course, intelligent women in the Middle Ages would have thought this.
No. What was her name again?
Manfreda.
All right. Okay. Yes, I remember her. Don't try this at home. Was she the one who also went through extraordinary sort of self-flagellation, etc., or was that Elizabeth of Hungary?
That's Elizabeth of Hungary, who may well have been the cousin of the woman who Manfreda thinks is the incarnation of the Holy Spirit. So all these heresies, they all join up. So Elizabeth of Hungary is again a kind of, and I think particularly at the moment with COVID, a fascinating figure, because again, if we look at what's happening to the economy at the moment, why I'm not at the literary festival, why we're doing the literary festival virtually, it's because the economy has been closed down, society's been closed down to protect the weak, to protect those who are most vulnerable, to protect those who are most likely to be sick. Why are we doing this? We're doing it because we take for granted this is what we should do. And in that light, Elizabeth of Hungary is fascinating because she is a princess from the Hungarian royal family. She marries the Margrave of Thuringia. She's a highly aristocratic figure. And yet after her husband's death, she ends up devoting herself so completely to the sick that she goes and works in a hospital. She cares for the sick. She swabs them. She hugs disabled people. She works in the kitchen. And this is not normal behaviour. This is not the kind of thing that people were doing in the pre-Christian world. And it emphasises the way in which if Christ has died the death of a slave, then, so Christians come to argue, the weakest, meanest, poorest, profoundest suffering person must also be close to Christ. In a way, must be closer to Christ than the richest person. And that's why the sick come to have a particular value for Christians, because they see in the sick the image of Christ's suffering death on the cross. And ultimately, that's why we're sitting here talking on Zoom rather than talking on a stage at the literary festival.
Tom, one final thought. If everything is so imbued with Christianity and we almost take it for granted in terms of the way we think and our values, I mean, do we need a Christian structure, if I could? Is there a need for a Christian church? Have we almost sort of passed beyond needing a kind of formalised structure of Christianity in our world if it's now just so much a part of the way we live?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and it's something that actually the role that the churches have played in this crisis has really brought home, because in a way we haven't needed them. Our society has become so saturated in Christian values that in a way we don't need the church anymore to tell us to care for the weak or the sick, because we just take that for granted. And in many ways, the reverence that we show the NHS, the rituals of praise that we have every week, these are rituals that have completely slipped the moorings of confessional Christianity. And if the pronouncements of bishops on what we should be doing, essentially they're simply rehashing government health warnings. They seem to have become kind of subordinates of the welfare state that simply kind of wear peculiar clothing. So I think there is a challenge there for the institutional churches that basically Christian enterprises like schools, like hospitals, have been nationalised. However, the broader question, I suppose, is, can we take for granted these impulses without the theology, without the history, without the framework of belief that historically has empowered them? And I think the jury is out on that. So there are various options, I think. One is, yes, Christianity, if you like, was the rocket booster. It's got us through the atmosphere, and now secular humanism, or whatever we want to call it, has become self-perpetuating, doesn't need Christian faith, it doesn't need any of that mumbo-jumbo anymore. It will just carry on blasting through space on its own impulse. Possibly. The other possibility, however, which was seen by Nietzsche, the great philosopher, even before the rise of fascism, is that without Christian teachings, humanity may default back to the assumption that the powerful and the strong are what it's all about, and we will start ignoring those who are weak, those who are poor. We will start to turn our back on the idea that we all have a common humanity. So that's another possibility. I think the third possibility is that people will start to worry about whether, on what basis can we uphold notions like human rights? What basis can we uphold notions like universal human dignity? And realize that ultimately these are faith positions. And that if they're faith positions, where does that lead us? And ultimately, I think it leads us back to the ultimate faith position, which is that of the Christian faith position. So it's possible to imagine that in the long run, if people in the West want to uphold their values, they're going to have to return to Christianity. So which of those three paths we will end up as societies taking, I don't know. It will be interesting to see.
Tom Holland on his book Dominion. 2,000 years of ideas, triumph, suffering, peppered with some truly larger-than-life characters. That interview was first recorded for the Chiddingston Literary Festival. If you have thoughts about this or any other podcasts, you can email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at @AndyBell5News. Thanks for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another one along soon.